South Africa tonight. Thanks so much for joining us on this Monday evening. Now, Jeremy, before we went off for a little bit, got me very hot under the collar. If I had a collar, I'd be very hot under it, because talking about the richest men on the planet compared to women, and I'm quite upset about that, Jeremy, because governments around the world can and must, as we know, build a human economy that is feminist and benefits the 99%. That is the message from Oxfam following the release of its Global Inequality Report 2020. I'd love to know what they found.
Well, Yvi, it's concluded that global inequality is out of control, and it blames that on what it terms biased systems that exclude many women. Again, to the statistic I quoted to you, women and or the world's richest 22 men have more money than all the women in Africa. Joining us now from Oxfam, gender lead for Southern Africa, Rukia Cornelius, good evening to you and welcome. Before we get to the statistics, the top line of your report suggests that equality worldwide is out of control. That's nothing new, though, is it?
No, absolutely not. Nothing new. It remains a dire situation across the world, like you said. 2,153 billionaires actually own more than 4.6 billion people on our planet, of our population. And so it's nothing new, and also nothing gets done about it. Nothing tangible, nothing commitments aren't met that are made, for example, in Davos as they meet now, whether that's, and our inequality report for 2020 focuses on the unpaid care work and domestic work that women do that contributes toward this economy.
12.5 billion hours of unpaid work, I think, every day. Is what
every day, yeah.
Let's talk about solutions in just a moment, because your recommendation calls for, and I quote, the transformative 4 Rs net framework. We can get to that in just a moment. But before that, you blame all of this on biased systems. I'm interested in what that means, but perhaps more importantly, how it pertains to the region that you operate in.
Yeah. I mean, biased systems, I think a good place to start is how policies are designed and set in countries around budgets, around austerity, around cutting of spending on public services. And those systems that are then implemented, more often than not, disenfranchise women and are biased against women and children, and women and girls particularly. So, for example, a system of where you have a water crisis in South Africa. Let's talk about South Africa. A water crisis means that when we have no water, women work 10 minutes longer, walk 10 minutes longer to get to water. They spend 3 hours and 55 minutes on care work, cleaning and productive labor in the household to be able to make sure that the rest of the household system and the ecosystem functions. That's just one of the systems of an economy that disenfranchises women.
In spite of what we would term an enabling and enlightened constitution in South Africa. Where's the disconnect then?
I think the disconnect is in policies that, I said, budgets that are set. The disconnect is in delivering on commitments made. The disconnect is in how women's work is not counted and valued in economies. Our report for 2020 indicates that you mentioned, Jeremy, 12.5 billion hours of work a day, which amasses to $10.5 or $10.8 trillion toward the economy, but it's not counted. It's not added into the economy. Today we met and we spoke at length with women domestic workers. I'm wearing a domestic workers T-shirt today. A system of legislation that says domestic workers have right to compensation, right to fair and equal pay, is not honoured, is not monitored, is not implemented. Healthcare workers and a whole layer of healthcare workers, as budgets get cut, healthcare becomes a responsibility of women, predominantly healthcare workers. And so there's all of these systems and socio-ecological systems that then begin to further disenfranchise not just women, but societies, and creates a planet that's burning.
So one of your solutions is taxing an extra 0.5% of the wealth of the richest 1% around the world. How do you arrive at those figures?
It's based on the amount of at the 0.5% addition.
Both.
Of both. the 22...
No, I'm saying why 0.5%? How did you reach that conclusion that would help massively, to quote your report?
Because we realized that illicit financial flows in all countries where wealth is accumulated from the south to north or to offshore accounts is between 1% and 3%. And so we're saying that if you were to take just a 0.5% of that illicit financial flows or taxes that are not paid, we'd be able to fund 117 million jobs extra. We could go higher, and it's also based on counting of national transfer accounts, and so accounts that measure intergenerational wealth and intergenerational how women and men show up in the economy. So it's a quite intricate model, but it's saying, and that's low-hanging fruit.
There's a degree of
mobility
as far as this is concerned, and it's difficult to argue against that, but it's also very idealistic, because that's never going to happen, is it?
30 countries in the next week are mobilizing around the Fight Inequality Alliance to ensure that our governments commit to that happening. I think the world is in crisis. We've just heard our president say South Africa's in crisis, and we cannot avoid addressing the responsibility of inequality at the government level, and so it has to happen. I think there's no other alternative for it but to happen. And we're trying to find solutions to how we can work with government to ensure that we're able to realize people out of poverty, realize dignified lives and dignified work for women and for the working poor, essentially.
Oxfam's gender lead for Southern Africa, Rukia Cornelius, thank you very much indeed. Some very disturbing and salutary numbers coming out of that latest Global Inequality Report 2020 from Oxfam.